Welcome, welcome to another episode of the Chasing Poker Greatness podcast. As always, this is your host, the founder of ChasingPokerGreatness.com, Coach Brad Wilson. And since today is Friday, I am joined by Duncan Palomortis. Duncan, how are you doing, sir?
Hello. Everything's going well. How's life going with you, Brad?
Life is quite well. I can't really complain. I think I've got my health, I've got my sanity. What else do I need?
That's exactly right. I feel exactly the same way. You know, when you have the basic needs met and the complaints, the issues that we have become so minuscule and so niche and so weird, you know, people are like listening and say, what the hell are you complaining about? So yeah, we've lost the right to complain a long time ago, I think. Yeah. So,
well, since everything's going quite well, let's get into the meat of today's show, which is obviously this is Philosophical Friday, and today we're going to be talking about biases, and this will not be a comprehensive breakdown of every single cognitive bias that humans possess, because that would be quite the long episode. And so the hope and the aim is to break this topic up into multiple shows. So it'll be an ongoing series with, part 1, part 2, and so on and so forth. And today we're going to talk about some specific ones that we have highlighted. And now I'll let you tell the listener what biases we're going to be talking about, or the first bias that we're going to be breaking down in today's show.
Sure. Yeah. Sort of like a spoiler alert. I'm resisting the temptation to have one episode per bias, because there's so many things we can say about a specific bias that
maybe it goes down that way. We only realize it if we get stuck on the first one for an hour. Then okay, yeah, we messed up, right? We're gonna do one bias per episode.
That's right.
Only one way to find out.
Only one way to find out. Yeah, because I mean, we do some preparation, but a lot of the stuff that we're doing it real time, right? I mean, we want to think this through real time and go back and forth.
Shockingly, we don't have a whole conversation that precedes the actual conversation. We just have the first one, and we don't always know where that's going to take us or how it's going to go.
That's right, exactly. But I mean, there are several definitions of what a bias is. The way I like to think of biases, I like to think of instead of opinions. So the way I like to think of opinions are dichotomized into two portions. The portion which we would call the bias, and I will define in a second, and the portion which I will call fact. So essentially, what the difference between the two is that factual approaches are ones which are somehow evidently based. So things which are, we have some evidence to, external evidence to think that they're true. And then the biases are some internal evidence to think they're true. So essentially, we have these two opposing forces, which internal versus external, which together they combine what we will form an opinion. And an opinion can be factually dense, or an opinion can actually be bias dense. Now, of course, we can get into the weeds, because what does it mean external? What does it mean to be internal? This can be very, very, very complicated. So for the sake of,
I would like to say too, we're shockingly inept at distinguishing between the internal and the external, and sort of assuming that the internal is factually true when that may not be the reality at all, right? We're just
correct.
Poorly designed biologically to discern well.
Correct, exactly. So, but in terms of a heuristic that we can use for biases, which we're interested in, because again, what a fact is not any easier than what a bias is, right? Even though we like to think that sort of like facts are good and biases are bad or along those lines, but it's actually very hard, much harder than this. For exactly the reasons that you said, it's very difficult to distinguish. But let's say heuristically, bias is a predisposition to a certain direction, regardless of environmental factors. And I would say environmental factors include both external and internal. So an example of that would be someone who says strawberries are delicious. I mean, I feel strawberries are delicious. No matter what you tell me, it doesn't matter if you tell me they're bad for you, or it doesn't matter if you tell me, they've been poisoned or whatever it is. I think they're delicious. So I'm predisposed to think they're delicious no matter what the circumstances are. So that would be a bias towards strawberries, right? But of course, the biases can become more dangerous when...
I think I have that bias.
Okay. Do you have, me too. I have bias towards beards too. So And we were thinking of tackling a few examples of those biases so that the things will become more explicit. For example, the number one bias that we were thinking of talking about today is what is known as the Dunning-Kruger effect, which basically, in a sentence, is the more you know, the less confident you're likely to be. So that's not the bias, that's actually the reality. Sometimes people call that, the circle of confidence. As I think Neil deGrasse Tyson has a very nice way of explaining this, the idea that knowledge is like a circle which expands as we get to know. But as we get to know more and more and more and more things, the circumference of that circle becomes larger. So the more we know, the more we realize that we don't know, because that circle grows, right? And that is the thing that typically when people are in a certain domain, because again, there's very different domains. Somebody can have a very large circle on a certain domain and a very low circle in another domain.
Yeah, when you broke it down that way, the Neil deGrasse Tyson little metaphor there, it made me think of like a child who's like 5 years old, that if you ask them, they know all the things about the world, right? Because their world is only their home for the most part, or the park with their mom and their dad. But as they learn more, as they know more and gain more knowledge, everything kind of expands to the point to where, most adults, I hope, after the age of 25, recognize there's a lot of things that they actually don't know, and a lot of things that will forever remain hidden or unknowable to them, just because we don't have enough time to know everything about everything.
That is exactly correct. And one of the things that happen with children in particular is that at some point in their lives, their first God sort of collapses, right? Their parents, right? Because they think that their parents know everything. So the first time one of the parents says, I don't know, or the kid doesn't get a satisfactory answer for the first time, something collapses there. Like that's, again, we can see the circle growing, and that is very much true.
Unless we're talking about my kids, because I know everything, and I've never said I don't know to them ever.
That is exactly right. That is exactly right. I was about to say that the Dunning-Kruger effect, I guess if we were to put it in a form of bias, is that sometimes people think they know more than they do, and that's because in order to know what you don't know, you need to be already knowledgeable. And
yeah, actually, I would frame it a little bit differently, in that it's really hard to know what you know. Also. On both sides, right? Like as you gain mastery and access lots of knowledge and have lots of knowledge on a specific topic, you also underestimate how much you know relative to other human beings. So it's more of like our relative proficiency with whatever it is. When we're new to something, we overestimate, and then when we're masters at something, we underestimate, which is just interesting in its own right.
It's beautiful that you mentioned that, because again, that is related to another bias, which is the curse of knowledge, which it becomes, the more we know something, the harder it is for us to gauge how much we actually know versus other people.
And you can't unknow it either.
You can unknow it, exactly.
And one thing about Dunning-Kruger, and I actually, I have a Wikipedia bias that's built into me. I tend to trust Wikipedia without diving deeper into the references. But I do remember reading at some point on Dunning-Kruger that, interestingly, the study is also culturally based, that it's has a higher relevancy to Americans versus like Japanese, which is just like an interesting side note in the Dunning-Kruger effect, and how, like, I have no idea the why that would be the case, other than like cultural, just the way that we think about ourselves, the way we self-analyze, maybe how teachers build us up or how society builds us up, sort of over time gives us this false sense, Americans, a false sense of confidence to their proficiency in any given topic or hobby or whatever, subject it may be. But I do remember reading that and thinking that was quite interesting, that like the other variable of culture can also affect these biases.
Absolutely. And that's actually very true. And it can be a good and a bad thing. I mean, the bad thing is, like, like sometimes I'm joking, there's two types of confident people: those who think they know what they're talking about, and those who know they don't know what they're talking about. And they're like, what's the point of not sounding confident? I might as well, right? So you're absolutely correct. But the good thing is in what you just described, that sometimes cultures, and for the most part, cultures have wise elements into them. So these quick heuristics, like these cultural elements, can help guide certain new people into, like the youth, for example, of the culture, right? Which it's the wisdom that, the predecessors are passing on to us. And of course, it's the youth's responsibility to question some of these ideas moving forward. But we do need, I don't qualify no longer as youth, but, we do need to have our youth to, the older people, give the youth the opportunity to learn some of the things that they struggle with. So I think that these cultural elements can potentially be useful, but you're raising the issue that they need to be questioned like everything else.
For sure. And if you were to ask, my grandparents, then should have been a Calvin Klein model and Major League Baseball player all rolled into one, along with, being an intellectual that changes the entire known universe, right? Like that's just that's how they see their genes in a younger form. They're like, yeah, right. That one, they're going to change everything. Look at them go.
But no pressure.
And no pressure. He's just amazing at everything. And we'll just you can do anything you want, right? Like that's the thing that we tell kids. You're smart enough, you're capable enough, you can do anything in the world that you want to do. That's not pressure, and also doesn't build ego, and it doesn't make somebody believe that like the first time you touch anything, you're already a master at it just from the jump.
Right, exactly. And that's actually an interesting topic, talk a little bit about psychology, like the benefits and the downsides. That's actually a pretty interesting one, because there's some good elements to it and there's also some bad elements to it. But
yeah. I mean, it is, but yeah, that's sort of my just sort of philosophical thought on why culture, or how culture can affect the Dunning-Kruger effect, like downstream, is just giving human beings a false sense of confidence in what they're capable of before investing any energy into any specific endeavor or topic. Because I can say, I was speaking in jest earlier, and it takes me an obscenely long amount of time to feel like I do something or anything well, like years and lots of hard work. And even then, like copywriting is one of the things I've spent years studying it, learning it, and I still feel like I'm just an amateur compared to some of the human beings that exist in the world can just write things that are just amazing.
Yeah, in my case, I never do feel like I do something well. This is the weirdest thing, but it's a blessing and a curse. You can always improve, but at the same time, you don't get the satisfaction of.
You don't think you're a good teacher? You don't think you're
I can
good
be
poker
so much
player?
better. Like I go out of that's the thing. That's why I stay up at night, because I'm saying I could have done these things so much better. Like I go out of my class sometimes and I say I could have done such a better job. There can be sessions you can say, well, I did the best I could, but there's always this thing that says you could have done this here, which could have been different, or you could have tried that, or you should have been more attentive to that question, or things like that. Yeah. So if we're framing things in terms of relatively, did Alex did a better job than Bobby at the poker table? That can be answered, but it's also sort of irrelevant, because if Alex puts her standards that are equal to Bobby's standards, she's not doing a personalized work, right? So that is another issue. So it's like, did Alex perform as well as Alex could have performed? That's and I'm talking about Alex because Alex is an idealistic person, right?
I asked a question about. I'll let you work this out with your therapist down the road. I asked a question to Duncan, and you started talking about Alex and Bobby. I don't know. But I understand what you're saying, right? Like it's classic high achievement, high performer thoughts and self-flagellation of I did something that most people really loved, and yet we have this sense that we could have done it much better. And so instead of focusing on the positives, which by the way, we have negativity bias as one of the things, we focus on what we could have done better or how we feel we fell short, even if nobody felt that we could have done better except ourselves, which is the only opinion, I guess, that affects us deeply.
Right. And in defense of that sort of like a psychological approach, I don't tend to be a negative person for the sake of the negativity. The reason why I concentrate on the things that can be improved is because I'm thinking to myself, there's not much I can do about the things that cannot be improved, whatever those may be, even whether they can be improved or not. I mean, it's irrelevant at this point, right? So it makes more sense to concentrate on the things that can be improved and not
Yeah.
waste time on the things that cannot be improved.
Well,
I mean, it's of course, sorry, go ahead.
No, this is we're getting on a tangent now, but so basically, like there have been periods of my life where I've struggled with being happy, right? I've struggled with feeling kind of blasé, below average, low energy, low motivation, and kind of a negative or pessimistic view of the world. And so, the things that we learn about, read about, try to figure out tend to be problems that we have ourselves, right? So I read lots of books on happiness, right? And what is happiness? Where does it come from? What are like the core things that make a person feel happier more often? And one of those things is savoring, right? There's gratitude, savoring, and service, which are kind of the three triangles of happiness: serving other people, being grateful for what you have, like genuinely feeling grateful for having running water and just all the things, and savoring the good, right? Savoring the happy moments or the moments of triumph and kind of just sitting with that emotion. And I think that high performers especially have trouble savoring. They have trouble accepting compliments. They sort of deflect, and they don't, or rarely, at least in my case, and I could be projecting to everyone, they rarely say like, well done, you did good. You should let yourself feel good about this for at least some period of time before, it's back to the drawing board. But that's something that is sort of innate in my biology, I believe. I've remember many instances of playing sports, winning, doing, achieving at a high level and never feeling anything except relief that I did what I was supposed to do. Right. So, this is like the expectation. Right. So there's limited joy and always negativity when things don't go according to plan. And I've had to like force myself to savor the good moments, savor those times where like, wow, yeah, I just did that. And like, that's cool.
Absolutely. And you're absolutely correct about that. And the one thing that I'm going to add, I love the tangents, by the way. That's why it's Philosophical Friday, right? Because we want to explore these ideas. But the only thing that I was going to add is that there are at least two different types of savoring these kind of moments. There's the moment of basically like sitting on that win and then basically feeling a little bit as if it's end all be all, like I did it. I'm so awesome that nothing matters. And there's the other thing that said, okay, yeah, I performed well. It was a good thing. I did what I could have done in this case. It worked well. Good job. Let's move on. There's two different types of savoring. Like the danger of one type is that one can feel a little bit too comfortable into a certain situation. That's the concern of mine, which is why I typically say it's not necessarily negativity, but it's not positivity either. It's more of like realism. There's a lot of more work to be done. It's okay to pat yourself in the back. You did what you could. It's the end of the day. It's time to sleep. That's great. But then there's going to be a tomorrow. And we need to remember, I mean, there's no such thing as need. When I say we, I mean, that's what I'm telling myself, right? I mean, I need to remember about tomorrow. That's what we means in that case.
Yeah. Who's the we when you're referring to yourself here? All the facets of Duncan. No, I don't want to ask that question because that's gonna take us to a whole nother level.
We're gonna talk about the power of now in Eckhart Tolle, right? Because he's talking about exactly the same things that he had in relation. Right. Who's the we? Okay, we're not gonna talk about
who's the we. My hand hurts, right? Well, like who am I, right? If this is my hand. Anyway,
that's exactly. But let us know in the comments, or if you guys want to talk about, like the inner self and the I and all of that psychological stuff of the inner self and talking to our inner self.
I'm personally like I've thought about that a lot. I've read books, and it's something that is actually quite meaningful to me. Figuring out, what I am, but not on the agenda for today's show. On the last thing that I'll say on savoring specifically is it doesn't have to be related to high performance either. I remember a very specific example in I'm quite proud of myself for actually realizing this in the moment, because it's something that I almost never have in my life. But the time when I met my wife, like the time when she was coming to visit, because we lived a few hours away from each other and we had been talking, and we'd finally like set up to go out on a date, right? And I remember like waiting for her to arrive and feeling like, all the anxiety, all the internal feelings of like waiting for this thing to happen. And I remember in the moment thinking like, savor this, right? Like this is a rare feeling, and it may be the last time that you feel something like this, right? Like in this specific context.
Right.
And I remember sitting there for, a few hours and just savoring that feeling, the excitement, the anxiety, and quite meaningful, quite a meaningful experience, and obviously a memory that I have, forever. I wish I could be that wise all the time, but like in that moment, I was like, wait, instead of being like, I wish you would just like get here, right? It was like,
Right.
let's savor this instead, which was a way better, just a way better path, in my opinion.
Absolutely. And that's the thing, like we have these moments of epiphany, which that's, I guess, what you can call it, an epiphany. You figured it out, and
Yeah.
that's great.
But now let's go to Dunning-Kruger,
Excellent.
because
So that's an excellent segue.
yeah, perfect, well,
Perfect segue.
smooth. Yep.
Super smooth. But let me just say something about the Dunning-Kruger. We do have a list here of some of the most famous biases. The explanation we have here is because experts know just how much they don't know, they tend to underestimate their ability. But it's easy to be overconfident when you have only a simple idea of how things are. And actually, I really like, they have a quote from Bertrand Russell here, very famous philosopher and logician of the previous century, who said, the whole problem with the world is that fools and fanatics are so certain of themselves, yet wiser people are so full of doubts. So this is a this is a burn. That's I guess we can call it. So this is a burn, basically saying that it is easy to have confidence when you don't know something than when you start knowing a little bit about it, because the more you uncover about a certain topic, the harder it becomes, because there's like more. It's sort of like a roots of a tree. The more you dig, the more complicated the roots get. One question I have for you, which I think is relevant to us: how does the Dunning-Kruger effect apply to poker?
Well, like on both sides of the coin, you have a new player who plays poker. I mean, think about every time you've read on Twitter or Facebook comments or YouTube comments about like online poker being rigged because of some sort of like distribution that is like just not possible, et cetera, right? Like when you start playing poker, and poker is like a deceptively easy game to learn, that, and we've talked about the complexity of the game, that when you don't really know a lot about what's going on, it's quite easy, when you're 5 years old, wandering around in your house and asking your parents, who are God everything. Well, that's sort of the same little metaphor that happens in poker, right? You get in there, you learn what the rules are, and then, oh, well, I know what the rules are, and so therefore I'm quite good at this game because now I can click the buttons. And you just overestimate how good you are, because, and this is, I don't know exactly how this ties in, but I have been watching on HBO Max Brene Brown's Atlas of the Heart. And in one of the episodes, she talks about comparing, and how human beings are hardwired to compare, and compete, right? And it's actually kind of like a crunch from both sides, where you want to be like everybody else, except better, right? Like you
Right.
want to be just like everybody else, but only better than them. You don't want to be excluded, so
Right.
it's so totally different, you're out. But you want to, and we're always in this crunch of comparison. And I think, like, because we're hardwired to do so in poker, that's the thing that we start with, is like we start comparing how we're playing versus other people. We gain some knowledge and we recognize, oh, this player's like limping all the time, they're terrible, right? And I'm good because I'm not limping anymore. And then that just sort of snowballs into, well, I must be better than all of these other players that I'm playing against. And then, yeah, we kind of accept our anecdotal experience in poker, which is another just giant pitfall that leads to all these biases down the road. We just expect that like we figured it out, right? And we've got the answers, and that makes us misjudge our competency. And then that's sort of the first part of Dunning-Kruger, is overestimating how confident you are at a specific task.
Absolutely, absolutely. And you did mention basically another bias, the bias of overgeneralization, the idea that you see a small sample there, and you may be right about a certain skill differential that you have from your opponents, but what you really are saying is you have a skill differential against those specific opponents. That doesn't necessarily generalize to the entire poker population, especially in tough tables.
Maybe you just have an edge pre-flop, right? And
that's right.
Like that's it. It could
That's
just
true.
be like at one phase of the game where you have this edge, and then you give it all back post-flop because you're atrocious, right?
That's exactly right. And to add to your very, very good point, I mean, I had countless conversations about online poker is rigged. And by the way, I'm going to put a parenthesis here because I do want to go back to that. I just want to say a quick tangent on that. But before that, but there's the other side also. So there's the people who think that poker is rigged, but there's also the people who think that they're so good at poker when they start out, right? Because again, it depends on what side of the variance you fall at the very beginning.
Well, right. But saying that it's rigged is also saying that how good they are. Because
Right.
if it was not rigged, then they would obviously be winning. I think that's
Correct.
the conclusion that I come to. When people complain about that, they're saying, well, under fair circumstances, because I'm so much better than my opponents, I would not lose. Therefore, because I lost, it must be rigged.
Right, exactly. That's a very good point. Yes. And sometimes it can be, like neutral or winning players in their minds. I think that at least neutral or usually winning players. You're absolutely correct. But
no, I think those are losing players.
No, they are, but in their minds, I mean.
Oh, yeah. Okay. In their minds. Yeah.
Yes.
Okay,
No,
yeah.
absolutely. Absolutely. Yes. Typically, they're losing players. And it's very difficult to actually show it to them. That's another issue, which is part of the parenthesis that I wanted to address. When it comes to a poker being rigged, we have to be incredibly careful because there is a point where actually poker could be rigged and we should be able to identify it, right? That's where things get really complicated. And this is something I've actually written about it extensively, and maybe at some point we can address it, but it's not, the spoiler is, it's not what most people think it is. So poker players should have a high threshold for variance, but there is a certain threshold of variance that if you cross it, then you sort of know that this is no longer due to randomness. There's some foul play going on, and it's incredibly complicated. But there's an entire theory, a mathematical theory, which is called statistical inference, is the fancy name, or essentially hypothesis testing, which essentially tells you, if things were random in a certain way, you would expect to see certain things. If you don't see those things, either you got incredibly unlucky to the point that you should probably buy like 11 trillion lottery tickets, or just something is rigged. And
right.
one has
and a good example of that, it comes from the poker apps that were so prevalent on the market maybe 4 or 5 years ago. Poker Master and their ilk, where I know a group of human beings that lost something, ran somewhere in the order of like thousands and thousands of buy-ins below EV when after they were all in on said apps, and they proved mathematically that it was impossible for such a thing to happen. And that's sort of like what I think about when I think about what you're saying, right? It's like there is a way to prove that, outside of just the odds of this specific thing happening in this specific way are just like almost non-existent, to the point to where we can say that something is up with the RNG or something is like happening behind the scenes.
That's exactly right. But there is also a bias. It's funny that you mentioned that, because there's a bias that ties to that idea. And that idea is that, I often tell people, let's say we play Yahtzee, right? I mean, you take 5 dice and you roll those dice, and then you roll them, and then you get a random thing, like a random looking thing. Let's say you roll a 2, 2, 3, 5, 6, 2, 2, 3, 5, 6. And then I
like that you said random looking, by the way. But
exactly. Yeah, of course. Yeah, because that's the problem. And, the person is like, oh my God, I mean, this is just nothing. I mean, I rolled a nothing. But if you think about it, try to roll that exact thing again.
Of course.
Right.
You got to roll something.
You got to roll something. So what you rolled is actually very unlikely. any roll is unlikely in Yahtzee, right? So the question is, where do we ask the question? Because if we ask the question ahead of time, try to roll a 2-2, 3-5-6, or whatever it is that I said, right? That's going to be very difficult to do. But in actuality, we're not thinking in those terms. If you roll a 2-2, 3-5-6, you're not going to think at all about it. But if you roll a 1-2-3-4-5-6, you're like, oh my God, I mean, it's in a row. I rolled a straight or whatever.
Right. Or 5-5-5, 5-5-5. Right?
Exactly.
Like all six, which is exactly the same likelihood as any other random roll.
Correct. If we color the dice, I mean, we don't want to get any into the nitty-gritty. You're absolutely correct. No, you're right. You're absolutely correct. Yeah. So every roll has the same answer, but certain rolls they look more appealing. And I know there's going to be some people who say, Duncan, we have to take into account the permutations. We're not talking about that. I mean, like color code the dice. So, and every outcome is going to be unique in that sense. But anyway, that's another type of bias. It's the idea that because we sort of like, I guess we can say, conventionally decide that certain outcomes of the dice or certain outcomes of the cards, like for example, you can say ace of spades, ace of hearts, is more important than 7 of spades, deuce of hearts, right? I mean, both of these outcomes are of equal likelihood, but for a conventional reason, we decided that ace of spades, ace of hearts is going to be better than 7 of spades, deuce of hearts, right? That's the same idea. And then we have like this bias to talk about luck just because certain hands are more important than others.
Right. And if you play a poker session and you get dealt 30 hands in 1 hour, right? Like what statistically are the odds that you got every single card that you got in the exact order that you got them, right?
Exactly.
Like very low. However, you must get cards, and so they must be something.
That's right.
And I think human beings are predisposed to also find patterns. We're kind of pattern seeking machines, which also kind of plays into plays poorly into believing that like poker is rigged or trying to like seek these patterns and make sense of them in a way that like they can understand when they're just noise for most part.
That is exactly correct. And this is actually legitimately a good segue for the next bias, which is confirmation bias, right? The idea that you look for ways to justify your existing beliefs or looking for patterns where none exist, right? The idea that, and the definition that we have here is that we are primed to see and agree with ideas that fit our preconceptions and to ignore and dismiss information that conflicts with them. And Richard Feynman famously has said that think of your ideas and beliefs as software you're actively trying to find problems with rather than things to be defined. And the first principle is that you must not fool yourself, and you are the easiest person to fool.
Yeah.
Richard Feynman I love him. A great physicist from Caltech nearby in Pasadena, California. Super cool dude. What do we think about confirmation bias, and how does it apply to poker? I mean, you already alluded some of it earlier.
Yeah, I mean, all of these biases are quite tough to navigate. Like confirmation bias is just all over Twitter. It's all over just social media in general. And actually kind of the algorithms play into our confirmation bias as well by creating these sort of echo chambers that give us information that we want to hear. But I think like confirmation bias in poker is very detrimental to people because it stops growth. And it also stops us from analyzing things more objectively, right? It's the opposite, or it's being results oriented, right?
That's right.
It's exactly being results oriented, which is, if you watch the 10 commandments of poker, like number 1 is thou shalt not be results oriented when you play poker, right? So like, yeah, I mean, you have to be just quite careful about, I guess first is understanding what you do believe and what you do think, right? Like have you previously fooled yourself, going back to that quote by Richard Feynman? And if so, then where and how and why, and what should you also analyze and take into consideration as well? Which, yeah, can go down a rabbit hole of like finding it hard to believe much of anything, right?
That's actually downside. I honestly think it depends how you do it. I think that it's actually a good heuristic, I would argue. That's where meta-humility lives, right? That's why I think we need meta-humility. If you always say, you know what, I'm incompetent, that's not meta-humility. That's basically handicapping yourself. But if in the back of your head, you know, listen, I mean, I'm a human. I have inherent limitations. I will never be able to overcome those limitations no matter what. That's the meta-humility. So, you know, I have to question myself at all times. What that means, though, however, is not to impede yourself, not what you're going to try things. It's like you're going to try the things that you're going to try. But in the back of your head, when you stop and ponder, when you do the exercise, when you go and you practice, then you're going to say, maybe I need to take a step back. I know I've said that, I've used that idea 10 times over. I've used it 100 times over. Heck, I've been using it for the past 10 years of my life. Maybe it needs to be questioned, right? I mean, maybe we need to think about it. Is this, I never limp. Maybe, some people say, limping is occasionally a good thing. Maybe try it again. Maybe see if there is something in there, but don't limp, seriously though. I'm kidding, that's a joke. All right, so I think you're absolutely right about this. And what are some instances of confirmation bias? Like, where are poker players habitually, and you mentioned one already, like being results oriented, right? What are some situations where we say, see, I told you, I run bad, or like stuff like that, where they basically isolate a specific component of the data and focus on that to prove themselves that they were right about something?
Yeah, I think it manifests in many different ways, but I have one personal story that I think is quite funny that applies here. I was at a final table in Tunica, which is quite a long time ago if I was ever at a final table. I believe it was like WSOP circuit 2006 or 7 or something like that. And I made the final table, made it to day 2. Back in those days, you played one day until you made the final table, and then you came back and played the final table. And they had like a bleachers set up around the final table. And this old couple who was watching the final table, I had 30% of the chips in play. So actually me and another guy had 30%. So like everybody else had not many chips. We were the overwhelming chip leaders.
Okay.
And
30% each or 30%
each.
Okay, very interesting. Okay.
Yes.
Yeah. Nice.
And another player had like 15% or so, like third place. And they pulled me aside before the final table started and said, these things get crazy. I was, 21, so they were giving me their advice and feedback from watching these things play out. These things are crazy. You can sit tight and just play well, and like don't get in there too early on. Just like let the tournament kind of come to you, basically. And right. I remember being 21 and just obviously being very humble and accepting all of the wisdom that I could get from everyone. That's a joke, Duncan, by the way.
I know.
There was literally zero humility there.
I know.
Second hand of the final table, I get kings and get it all in pre versus the player who is in third place with 15% of the chips. I get it in with kings. They have aces, and I double them up. And I just kind of, it was a moment where I locked eyes with them in the bleachers, and they just kind of looked at me, and they were like, I could just see their sadness and disappointment. Like, didn't you just listen to what we told you not to get involved? And that to me is like just a funny little story about like confirmation of like, yeah, we told you not to get involved in a spot where like, obviously you have kings versus aces, right. Nothing to do. Yeah. And subsequently I totally imploded at that final table and got 6th place. And the only reason why I got 6th was because I had so many chips that I couldn't bust out sooner than the other 4 people. But anyway, yeah, that to me, like when players talk about like ace king, for instance, and I talk to everybody around here, like 90% of the people busted out with ace king, like it's a drawing hand. And these sort of like they're almost tropes in the poker world at this point. Yeah, those are all examples of like confirmation bias, just seeking out, oh, did you bust with ace king? Like, how have you done with ace king today? Like, that to me is they're just trying to confirm that ace king is not that great of a hand and shouldn't be played aggressively, etc.
That's exactly right. Or, I never hit those draws, I never hit a flush draw or stuff like that. And maybe they hit like 3 draws in a row, but those don't
Chasing is
register.
bad, right?
Chasing,
Chasing is bad. Which, by the way, chasing.
it depends what you
Wait,
chase.
wait.
If you chase
Chasing is
poker
a good
greatness, that's
word.
a good thing.
Yeah, I was gonna say chasing is a great. I had to catch myself.
You're too slow. You're too slow, Brad.
Yeah, I'm gonna ignore that landmine. Actually, just use the word chasing. It's totally fine and acceptable, and doesn't mean anything. So anyway, those are all my stories, and now I'm so flustered that I don't know what to say.
No, that's great. I think that's an excellent story. And people like to do that. You see, just looking at it at a single data point. And this is incredibly dangerous when it comes to poker. And the way I like to see it as an example, I mean, for poker commentators, be wary of any poker commentator who, while they see their cards, they never tell you that somebody makes the opposite of what you would expect to do if you could see the cards. So an example of that would be, let's say that somebody's facing a river decision on the river. The other guy clearly is bluffing, and then they're sitting there with a bluff catcher, let's say an under pair, like tens, there's an ace on the board. And then, the commentator says, maybe that person should call with tens. For me, that's confirmation bias. Like a good commentator should actually tell the listener sometimes, or at least suggest a line which is obviously wrong if they could see the cards. That's a sign of a good commentator, right? Somebody who is not biased by the cards they see, because again, we don't have that information real time. And that's another example of a lot of confirmation bias.
And to be fair to the poker commentators out there, as somebody that breaks down hand histories with students and with my wolves all the time, whenever the whole cards are up, right, and we're looking at the hand history, like it is quite difficult to block out that information and make like a rational judgment call, to the point to where like I tell my guys like hide the cards because I don't want to know, because if I do know, I'm going to be biased. Like that's how pervasive it is, whether subconsciously it's like I know what they have, so like now my opinion is just totally tainted.
I do too, and actually that's a very good point. It's very, very difficult, and actually brings to another important question: Can biases be avoided?
That's I don't know. What's your?
My approach to this is the answer is I mean, it's much more nuanced than that, but my approach to that is no. And the reason for that is because we cannot discard all the influences that we got from the time we were born all the way to what we ate this morning, right? So it's very, very difficult. Right, it's very difficult.
Why don't we just segue right now to curse of knowledge, because this is like the perfect. This flows almost perfectly into curse of knowledge. But anyway, finish your statement.
No, you're absolutely right. I mean, this is we can talk about that, but yeah, I think it's very difficult, and I think people who say that they're unbiased, they're probably the most biased people in the world, because they're also biased and misguided. Right? Because we cannot get rid of the biases that we have. The only thing that I feel we can do, and of course I can elaborate in a separate podcast, the only thing we can do is basically tame those biases or be aware of them or give disclaimers, first and foremost to ourselves, because sometimes we have those biases and we don't even know about it. Right. So, but it's very, very difficult for the biases to be avoided.
And speaking of, biases, like I said, I've been watching Brene Brown's Atlas of the Heart, and another point that she made that I think applies directly to poker is that we think of ourselves as logical, cognitive beings that have emotions, when we're actually emotional beings that have cognition. And there's quite a big difference in that thinking, and that we think that we can just like tame these biases and tame these emotions, when the reality is that's just who we are. It's how we're constructed, which makes it incredibly difficult to avoid them or to, not get caught up in them. And I think just having awareness that you may be biased is probably the first step. Like asking the question of like, am I biased here? Do I think I am to the best of my ability? And in which case you probably are, and will probably miss it in many cases, even with that.
And to your point, Brad, because you're making an excellent point, we're emotional human beings with cognition, right? This is an idea actually that Daniel Kahneman is talking about in his book, Thinking Fast and Slow. The metaphor he's giving, which I absolutely love, and I'm going to paraphrase it here. He's talking about two systems. System one, which is essentially what you would call the emotional system, the one which is very responsive, right? The one that doesn't think, the instinctive one. And then system two, the slow processing one. And the one where you have to take a second and think about it. So system one would be the one responsible for when you're driving, you hit the brake. You don't think about it. When you see danger, when you see something out of the ordinary, immediately in split second, you will hit the brake. System two will be the one that will do long division. Take your time, think about it, get the decimal point right? So what happens, and this is actually very interesting, the two can conflict with one another. What I often tell to my students is that when you do high-level math, 2 + 2 is no longer 4. Your brain cannot process quick information anymore because you've dug into the depths of system two. You're slowly thinking, you're in a different realm. So that idea that we're emotional human beings with cognition is exactly that. Most of the decisions are in split seconds, and usually they're good because we survived. That means we have the genes of people who are able to reproduce, which means they avoid all the dangers in the past. We're great at this. Human beings are amazing. Humans are awesome, right? But occasionally there's going to be a task that the instinctive, snap judgment system is not going to be able to do it correctly. And that's what we need to slow down. We need to basically regress in the system one capabilities for a second. We're not going to be able to do 2 + 2 = 4 quickly anymore because we're in system two territory. And I'm oversimplifying, of course. And, psychologists, they are going to just screaming on their screens. But that's the basic idea. And that is a very good point that you mentioned. And we are emotional human beings. We're instinctive human beings with cognition. So we need to slow down when we need to put the cognition into it. It's not our default mechanism.
Right. And we could also go into how that affects human beings' ability to navigate a game like poker, being emotional creatures with cognition. I would be on the side of it makes it really hard to be totally rational in every single decision that you make, regardless of who you are as a human being. But segueing in, that could be a topic of another episode of Philosophical Friday. But the curse of knowledge is the final one that we're going to do today. And yeah, I'll let you give a breakdown of the curse of knowledge, and then we'll just go from there.
Absolutely. And this is basically the curse of the educator. What differentiates good educators from bad educators? The idea is that once you understand something, you presume it to be obvious to everyone, right? Especially if it's something you've been doing for a long time. Come on, 7 deuce, you're never supposed to be involved with that hand, right? I mean, it's instinctive. It has come to your unconscious competence level, right? I mean, you're not even thinking about it. And let me read a little bit of what we have here in the notes. Things make sense once they make sense, so it can be hard to remember why they didn't. We build complex networks of understanding and forget how intricate the path to our available knowledge really is. And essentially what that says is that, we don't truly know exactly how knowledge is being transferred from one person to another. We don't really know exactly how we learn. That's why there's researchers in education. We don't know exactly how learning occurs. And it does occur when it occurs, and sometimes we forget how it happened, what clicked it for us, and what clicks it for one person doesn't click it for another. When teaching someone something new, go slow and explain like they're 10 years old, but without being patronizing. That's another curse of the educator, right? I mean, I've been accused many times, that sometimes I'm too slow in the way I'm explaining things, and I apologize in advance.
Well, you're kind of stupid, so I have to.
Yes, I am exactly. That's what I'm saying.
I have to slow down for you.
That's it. Oh no! I thought you were talking that about me. And I was like, I am stupid. No. Yes. So I was like, yeah, that makes sense.
I was talking about all your students. Don't worry about
my students. I was like, no, Brad, you nailed it. I am stupid. So that's why I'm saying slowly for me to understand it too. Repeat key points and facilitate active practice to help embed knowledge. And this is one of the hard. I mean, now I'm speaking from personal experience. This is one of the hardest things there is, trying to basically pretend that something, not necessarily, you don't know it, because again, I go from the assumption that personally, I don't know anything, but at least you haven't seen it before. You don't have the experience that you do. And that is unquestionable. Like when you're teaching a subject, you most likely have a lot of experience in it. Whether or not you understand it fully is a different question. But that experience needs to be taken back a step so that to relieve the same experience that the students are having, try to relieve that experience of trying to approach it for the first time, to experience it for the first time. And that's difficult.
Yeah, it is quite difficult, and is also what makes a bad teacher and great teachers, right? Like that's the difference, is relaying that information, transferring it to other people in a way that they can understand. That's the thing that it's difficult, yet I love that problem just as a human being. It's like, I know this thing and somebody else doesn't know this thing. And like, how do I bridge that gap in a way that resonates with them so that they get it, right? They get it much faster than it took me, or much quicker than it took me to get it, because I was on my own figuring this out from the jump, or learn it from another person, or just however the information kind of came to me. But yeah, I mean, that to me is like creating that map to help bridge that gap is incredibly challenging, incredibly difficult. And I think very few people, coaches, educators, invest the amount of time that's appropriate in solving these questions and solving this problem and building, that bridge or that map that can help human beings understand something much better. It's a major challenge of teaching. It's a major challenge of coaching. I tend to like that challenge, though, just because I like thinking deeply about things, and I like answering weird or solving weird problems that maybe nobody else does enjoy solving.
Absolutely. No, that's great. And this is actually essentially that challenge that you're describing. I mean, it reminds me of Socrates, basically. And I mean, people call it now the Socratic method, but basically the idea of trying to uncover truth by asking questions. That challenge that you're describing is the idea of essentially trying to get yourself out of the problem, but in a heuristic kind of realistic type of way. What do I mean by that? Like, let me give you a specific example. Let's say that, again, in very broad strokes, because we don't want to go into complicated examples, in very broad strokes, let's say that we're trying to explain to somebody why, in general, aggression is something that is needed in poker, right? I mean, why, for example, betting is typically better than just checking or taking like passive line in a vacuum. There's no way we can convince anybody to say, betting, you should be betting, like that doesn't make any sense. So we need to ask ourselves, okay, why do we bet? First of all, we need to ask ourselves, like, why do we bet? And then we ask ourselves, okay, what happens if we don't bet? So let's throw that away, Picasso style, right? I mean, let's forget about betting. There's no betting. What happens in a game with no betting? That's a question we ask ourselves, right? I mean, first of all, but then we can ask the students, what happens in a game where there's no betting? Imagine poker with no betting, right? And this is something we can do. It doesn't matter the level of cognition we're in the poker. We can envision a game without betting, right? And that's what I would ask my students. Like, let's play that game for a second. Let's say we have antes so that we play for something. So just antes, but no more betting. What happens there?
You just check it down.
Exactly. You check it down.
Or if there's no antes, you choose to call the blind, and then you check it down.
Check it out. Exactly. Very good. And then what happens? Like if I've been asking that question myself, I mean, what happens in that case in the long run? So who wins?
All of your equity gets realized.
Right.
That's a thing that happens.
Exactly. That's a very sophisticated answer, by the way. A+ for Brad.
Thank you. Since nobody's betting, I get to always realize my equity.
That's correct.
Who wins? I mean, the person that chooses the highest equity hands to call with in the appropriate situations and are able to compare their equity versus the equity of the remaining ranges, in which case, like a hand that has, an equity advantage versus like the big blind that has playing 100% of hands and you're on the button, right?
All of that is actually perfectly correct, and of course, no surprise there. But what happens if there's no calling? It's just antes. There's no hand selection because there's no betting involved.
Yeah, then the rake wins.
The rake wins, exactly. So totally all win equally, yeah. And then the rake wins. That's exactly right. So it must be the case that the betting does something. So the betting actually does something.
Well, what about this one? Like we said, no betting, right? But technically, the blinds are a blind bet, right? So what if there are no blinds?
Right, exactly. What happens if there's no blinds? Exactly. That's another important question. We do realize that we actually play for the blinds, because if you allow betting but you don't allow blinds, then you don't play unless you have the nuts. Like, why risk?
You have aces and then you just go all in.
Exactly.
That's the whole game.
That's the whole game. Exactly. That's another thing. But you get the idea, right? So by actually taking stuff out that's the only way we're forcing ourselves to get
Right.
out. Like we deprive ourselves from the tools that we've been using all of our lives, and then we play these hypothetical scenarios. And I think that is a heuristic against the curse of knowledge.
Yeah, and I don't know if it's like kind of surprising to anybody else, but it's like shocking to me when you actually fundamentally think that like all the actions in poker, all the grids, all the charts, they're designed to attack those 1.5 blinds that are out there, right? Like that's what the whole game is centered around.
That's
those blinds, which is why like protecting your blinds is quite important because like
and attacking somebody else's blinds is also quite
and attacking other people's blinds is also quite important, right? Because like that's what's stimulating the action from everywhere. Everything kind of stems from the attacking of those blinds, which, yeah, when you really think about it, is like, I don't know, it's just kind of shocking or interesting in my opinion.
Absolutely. And this is one of those aha moments, that when you see that, let's say your win rate from the button is whatever, like, a third of a blind per hand or something like that. And then you raise it from the button with a strong hand in your opponent's fold, then you get 1.5 blinds, all of a sudden you realize, holy smokes, I made 6x my average win rate from that one hand. On average, I win, a third of a blind per hand, and all of a sudden I made 6 of those things.
Well, that is a little deceptive because like the average of each individual hand that you raised from the blinds, like they all have an average and an expected value.
No. What I'm saying is that if you raise from the button, let's say, and you have a win rate of about a third per hand, and in any situation where you win the blinds outright, that's like 6x your average.
Right. What I was saying is when you have aces, it's going to be much higher than the average, right? Than the average hand that you open. Right. In which case, I'm still going to be. You're never going to make me not sad about raising aces on the button, Duncan, and the blinds folding.
You're absolutely correct, and that's why I said a good hand. I didn't say the best hand.
Yeah.
However,
okay.
Yes, okay, but you're absolutely right. I mean that's actually true. But even with aces, it's not insane. It's not like, but I mean, obviously, like we make a lot of
we're maximizers, Duncan. It's more than 1.5. That's all right. That's the only thing that matters to
me. That's exactly right.
But yeah, the curse of knowledge is where we're at in our biases. And yeah, I think it's a good tool to use for growing your knowledge of poker too, is like asking yourself why, right? Like doing the thing that, kids do that can drive myself and other parents crazy.
Right.
Ask why about everything and just like keep asking why until like you get to this point to where you can no longer answer it. Right. But like, why do I open? Why am I betting a third on the flop? What's happening here? Right. Like, how do we find EV? How do we find equity? What does equity mean? Like all of these whys about like functionally what's happening at the poker table when you do these things. Why do we play, king, queen off from middle position? Like, why do we play a 3-better fold strategy, from all the spots that are not the button or the big blind when we're facing an open, right? Like why do the solvers advocate for such a thing? And are there instances where we could outperform solvers in those spots? I'm just like, why does all of this stuff happen? And then you find yourself understanding poker. Well, you either find yourself in one of two ways. One is you go insane, and you lose your mind. And the other thing is you just learn more about poker and you understand the game at a deeper level than you previously have, which is ultimately a really good thing because we've talked about it before in the solver discussion about really needing to understand what's happening in a solver that gives you the outputs that it does. Well, how can you progress and think about poker at a high level if you don't even know what's happening when you place a bet? Like all the things that are happening when you place a bet or when you check or when you call, because all these things have utility and all of these things are doing something. And it's up to us as poker players to really understand that. And I think that it's kind of like everything that we have in modern poker these days is like layered on top of that, and we just kind of forget the basics or forget to explore the very basics of the way that the game is constructed so that you can make sense of everything that's then layered on top of that. It's just a critical piece of learning and growth that almost everybody just skips right over.
Absolutely. And to your point, an extra thing that you can do on top of those whys, which I think they're fundamental, would be a heuristic, if you will, because sometimes, asking a why might not have an answer. One way to sort of like trigger an answer or explore an answer would be find an alternative. What would be the alternative, right? You're asking the question, why do I want to have a 3-betting range, let's say from the small blind? What is the alternative? What can happen in the alternative? Explore, try. I mean, to tie some of the conversations we talked before, try different things, experiment, like sit at the poker table, try those things, see how they work for you. And also some of your other very important points. I mean, there's so much to unpack in what you said. It's just super brilliant. The idea, for example, that you mentioned that you may go insane, which is actually pretty true. Like you mentioned that earlier, like successful poker players need to be a little bit crazy. And I would add to that that's why poker is not for everybody. There's nothing wrong with that. I mean, I know I cannot throw a football, for example. If you guys want to, have fun, just sit down at the table and just keep throwing me footballs, and then, enjoy, make bets, and how many of those am I going to catch? It's going to be over under 20%.
So I take it you're not good at catching nor throwing the football.
That is absolutely correct, sir.
Neither component.
I'm very proud of it. I may be the worst thrower and catcher on the entire planet. So and it's okay. I'm sure people can give me tips and everybody can improve on things, but there's people with like different types of kinesthetic intelligence. That's okay. There's nothing wrong with any of that. And I know this is not something I'm good at. But what you're talking about, the idea of experimentation, the idea of asking why, and I'm also suggesting try the alternatives that can actually help you build a certain training regimen that can actually help you improve as a player and decide for yourself if this is something that is for you.
Yeah, I would say though that like it's quite a difficult thing when made the joke about going insane. The reason is because it's very difficult to find all the whys, and there's some whys that I'm spotty on, right? And people ask questions in Slack, Greatness Village, about like a pre-flop spot, right? And I try to convey that like we need to understand how pre-flop works, right? And like what are their principles in play here? Because like I can help you with this spot, but like it's like give a man a fish or teach a man to fish, right? They need to be taught, and you're not going to ever be able to learn what's going on until you understand the fundamental concepts that make up this game that you're trying to play. And it's quite difficult to go down into that lower level. I would say for some people, maybe even impossible to hit the bottom and see exactly all the things that are going, just because there's so many layers and so much nuance that's happening when you play poker.
That's right. And that is why I spend so much time on chapter 3 on my book, not to plug the book again or anything like that, but the idea of what goes into those preflop charts. Like, why are they the way they are? What is it so interesting about specific hands versus others? And there's a lot of nuance. And once again, the reductive process works there. You remove a certain assumption. You say, okay, what happens if I play this hand instead of not playing? Or what happens if I don't play this hand instead of playing? And then you get to see the difference. Of course, if you do, you can either do that with 1 million data points or 1 trillion data points, or we can do this as a thought experiment, sort of like try to make a case for it. But either case, however, is not going to be clear cut. It's going to be very, very difficult to do.
Yes. And, as we close down this episode of Philosophical Friday, if you listen to the first episode where I had Duncan on and he was talking about writing his book, because it was a thing I was thinking about a ton at that time, I recognized the challenge of explaining in a simple way the things that are going on at the poker table. It is a Herculean task, and I did not envy Duncan having to write that, put it down into words systematically in a way that helped people make sense and see all of these things that are going on. It's just an extreme challenge and quite a difficult endeavor. So yeah, many kudos for you taking on that project, because I think I don't know if people who are listening to this right now really understand the level of difficulty that goes on in trying to do that.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Yeah, I mean, it's on the one hand is It feels like some of the criticism is that, oh, Duncan, like some of that stuff is obvious. And what I tend to quote is that I think it was Schrödinger who said that, Erwin Schrödinger, but I could be wrong about this. There was a scientist who basically said, when there's a new idea, everybody is rejecting it as absolutely ridiculous until eventually that idea, if it's a good idea, it sort of like resists the criticism and the pushback. And then eventually it is accepted as obvious. So now everything in the end, and again,
it's almost anti-fragile, right?
Anti-fragile, exactly. So it is a little bit dangerous to talk about, what is obvious and what isn't, because first of all, what is obvious is not obvious for everybody. That's exactly the point of the curse of knowledge. And second of all, what does obvious mean? If an argument makes sense, it doesn't mean that it's clear for somebody to come up with the argument in the first place, right? It's and that happens in mathematics all the time. You ask somebody a question to a riddle, which is, complicated. They don't know the answer to it. Then you give them the answer to say, oh yeah, the answer is obvious. Yeah, well, why didn't you give it to me in the first place?
Hindsight bias.
Hindsight bias, exactly. So obvious is not necessarily a measure. Whether or not something is obvious is not necessarily a measure of whether it's useful or it is easy to reach out.
Yeah, I agree completely. And I think that all of those things, that if they were obvious to someone, I would say that's a good indicator that you need to think more deeply about said thing, because these things are not obvious at all. And with that said, I think it's time to wrap up this week's episode of Philosophical Friday. It's been great. Let us know in the community or via email whether or not you liked this dive into biases and which biases you would like us to cover next time. Spoiler alert, even if nobody tells us that you like them, we're still going to make the episodes. Just you can deal with it.
Because we need to keep our sanity a little bit. But we're happy, by the way. We're happy to, we'll listen to the community. So if you guys have some questions. And where can they find us, Brad?
Yeah, greatnessvillage.com. Just join the email newsletter, hop into Slack community, and there's a Philosophical Friday channel, hashtag philosophical-Friday, that you can access both me and Duncan and ask questions to your heart's content, or, yell at Duncan, scream at Duncan, feel free. That's actually encouraged in the community. Don't yell at me though. But Duncan,
he can take it. Yeah, that's absolutely. He can take it. Don't worry about it. He's Greek. He was raised in an environment where don't worry about it. Greeks, we have very, very thick skin. So go ahead.
Brutal. All right. Well played, sir. Well played.
And on Twitter
at CPG Podcast and Ask the Math Doctor.
And on YouTube also, we'll post links on why Alex beats Bobby at poker.
Yes. You guys have a good week. Thanks for listening, and we'll catch you next time.
Absolutely. Thank you, Brad.